what happens when, a king's biggest enemy is his own son. Who pays the price when a powerful duke decides he knows better than the emperor? And who is left to clean up the mess when brothers with crowns and armies forget they are family? So often, it was a woman. A queen, a wife, a mother, or a sister, standing between men who let pride and ambition drive them toward ruin. They were the mediators, the negotiators, the peacemakers, who had to use their wits to stop the men in their lives from tearing their kingdoms and their families apart. Number 20. Why did a mother have to choose between her warring sons? A woman born a slave became the legal wife of the most powerful sultan on earth, a thing that had never happened before in the Ottoman Empire. This same woman, Hürrem Sultan, would watch her own sons march toward a civil war for the throne she helped secure. The Ottoman law of fratricide meant that when a new sultan came to power, he often had his brothers killed to prevent challenges. For a mother, succession was not just a political game. It was a life or death matter for her children. Hürrem Sultan was the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. She was brilliant and politically sharp. She had risen from nothing to become the most powerful woman in the empire. But even she could not solve the problem of her sons Seyzade Selim and Seyzade Bayezid. They were the only two left standing after their other brothers had died, and they hated each other. Suleiman was getting old. Everyone at court knew the question of succession was urgent. Selim was the older of the two. He was governor of a province close to the capital. This gave him an advantage. But he was not a popular figure. Many saw him as lazy and disinterested in the hard work of governing. He was nicknamed Selim the Sot for his love of wine. Bayezid was younger, more charismatic, and a proven military leader. He was a lot like his father in his youth. The elite soldiers, the Janissaries, adored him. This made him dangerous. Hürrem saw the storm coming. She spent years trying to manage her two sons. She would write them letters, begging them to show a united front to their father. She knew Suleiman hated any sign of rebellion or ambition from his children. He had already executed his firstborn son, Mustafa, from another woman because he suspected him of treason. Hürrem knew the same fate could befall Selim or Bayezid if they stepped out of line. Her letters were a constant balancing act. To Bayezid, she would urge patience. She would tell him to obey his father's commands without question to prove his loyalty. She tried to calm his fiery temper. To Selim, she would urge diligence. She told him to act like a future sultan, to show the court and his father that he was more than his reputation. She tried to make him see the threat his brother posed. She acted as a go-between, softening the angry messages they sent to each other through intermediaries. She would pass along family news, talk about their children, anything to remind them they were brothers, not just rivals. The problem was that the men around them profited from the conflict. Powerful viziers and generals picked sides. One group supported Selim, hoping for an easily controlled sultan. The other group backed Bayezid, hoping for a return to military glory. And Hürrem was fighting not just her sons' personalities, but an entire political system that was pushing them into a fight. For years, her influence worked. She kept a fragile peace. As long as she was alive, neither son dared to make a major move against the other. They knew it would break their mother's heart, and more importantly, bring their father's wrath down upon them. And Hürrem was the buffer. She could go to Suleiman and smooth things over, explain away a rash comment from Bayezid or a lazy decision from Selim. She was the only person the Sultan trusted completely. But then, in 1558, Hürrem Sultan died. The buffer was gone. With their mother no longer there to mediate, the rivalry between the brothers exploded. Suleiman, old and grieving, saw only ambition and defiance. He began to favor Selim, seeing him as the less rebellious, more obedient son. Bayezid felt slighted and betrayed. He saw his father's favor as a death sentence. If Selim became sultan, he knew he would be executed. Within a year of Hürrem's death, the brothers were openly gathering armies. Suleiman sent support to Selim. He ordered Bayezid to move to a more remote province, a clear sign of displeasure. Bayezid refused. It was an act of open rebellion. In 1559, their armies met near Konya. Selim, with his father's backing, had the superior force. Bayezid was defeated. He fled with his sons to the neighboring Safavid Empire, the Ottomans' greatest enemy. It was the ultimate act of treason. Suleiman negotiated with the Safavid Shah. He paid a huge amount of gold. In 1561, Bayezid and his 4 sons were handed over to an Ottoman agent and executed. The path to the throne was now clear for Selim. The peace Hürrem had fought so hard to maintain had died with her. Her attempts to mediate had only delayed the inevitable tragedy. Number 19, could a queen's secret diplomacy stop a war between her husband and her brother? Eleanor of Austria was a Habsburg, the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She was also the Queen of France, married to King Francis. Her brother and her husband were the 2 most powerful men in Europe. They were also bitter, lifelong rivals who were almost constantly at war. The battle for control of Italy, a conflict that had been raging for decades, was central to their rivalry. It drained the treasuries of both Spain and France and destabilized the continent. Eleanor was a pawn in their game. Her marriage to Francis in 1530 was part of a peace treaty, the Treaty of Cambrai. The idea was that a family tie would stop the fighting. It didn't. Eleanor was in an impossible position. She was loyal to her husband, the King of France, but she was also a Habsburg, loyal to her brother, the Emperor. She was a quiet, serious woman, often overlooked at the glittering French court, but behind the scenes, she worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between the 2 men. The main point of conflict was the Duchy of Milan. Both Francis and Charles believed they had a claim to it, and Francis was obsessed with conquering it. Charles was determined to keep it within his imperial sphere of influence. Their fight over this one piece of land in northern Italy would drag on for years. Eleanor's role as mediator was constant and personal. She maintained a private correspondence with her brother Charles. This was risky. If her letters were discovered, she could be accused of spying for the enemy. But she used this channel to pass information, to gauge her brother's mood, and to suggest paths to peace. She would try to soften the harsh positions of both sides. She would tell her husband that Charles might be willing to negotiate even when the official messages were hostile. She would write to her brother, explaining Francis's point of view, trying to make him seem less aggressive and more reasonable than his actions suggested. Her biggest test came in 1538. Francis and Charles had once again been at war. The Pope, Paul III, was desperate to unite them against the Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean. He arranged a peace conference in the city of Nice, but the 2 kings hated each other so much they refused to even be in the same room. The Pope had to shuttle between them, staying in separate buildings. The negotiations stalled. Eleanor saw an opportunity. She traveled to Aigues-Mortes, a nearby town. With the help of the Pope, she convinced her husband and her brother to meet. It was a huge breakthrough. They still wouldn't sit down for a formal political meeting, but they agreed to a more personal gathering. They met on a ship, then at a feast. It was incredibly tense, but Eleanor was there, a constant calming presence. She talked with both men, reminding them of their shared faith and the larger threats to Christendom. Her presence made it harder for them to treat each other purely as enemies. They were family, whether they liked it or not. The result was the Truce of Nice. It was not a permanent peace, but it stopped the fighting for a few years. It was a personal victory for Eleanor. She had brought the 2 most stubborn men in Europe to the table. She showed that her quiet, persistent diplomacy could achieve what loud, aggressive politics could not. Of course, the peace didn't last. A few years later, they were at war again. Francis never gave up his dream of conquering Milan. Charles never gave up his determination to stop him. Eleanor continued her work, writing letters, arranging quiet meetings, and trying to manage the egos of the men who surrounded her. She was never fully successful in creating a lasting peace. The rivalry was too deep, the stakes too high. But she did succeed in creating moments of calm. She prevented several crises from spiraling into all-out war. She was a constant advocate for diplomacy in a world that preferred to solve its problems with armies. She spent her entire life as Queen of France trying to mediate a fight that could never truly be won. Number 18. What if a queen had to negotiate peace with her own stepmother? Louise of Savoy was the mother of King Francis I of France. Margaret of Austria was the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The two men were, as always, at war. In 1525, Francis was captured in battle at Pavia and taken to Spain as Charles's prisoner. France was in chaos. Louise, as regent for her imprisoned son, had to hold the country together. She was a shrewd and capable politician, and she needed to be. The war was a disaster for France. The treasury was empty. The army was broken. The king was in a foreign prison. Louise knew she had to negotiate, but negotiating with Charles V was nearly impossible. He was demanding huge concessions, the return of Burgundy, the renunciation of all French claims in Italy, and a massive ransom. These were terms France could not accept. The formal negotiations led by men went nowhere. The diplomats argued over legal texts and ancient claims. They postured and threatened. Nothing was accomplished. The situation seemed hopeless. Francis grew sick in prison. France grew weaker. This is where the women stepped in. Louise of Savoy knew she needed a different approach. She reached out to Margaret of Austria. Margaret was the governor of the Habsburg Netherlands. She was also Charles V's trusted aunt and advisor. And, importantly, she was Louise's sister-in-law. Louise's late husband and Margaret's late husband were brothers. This family connection, however distant, was something the women could use. They understood things the male diplomats did not. They understood the cost of war, not just in territory and gold, but in lives and stability. Louise and Margaret began a correspondence. They decided to meet in person away from the prying eyes of the formal court. They chose the city of Cambrai. They would negotiate a peace themselves. This was highly unusual. Major international treaties were the domain of kings and their ministers. For two women, even two powerful women, to take the lead was a radical step. The negotiations were known as the Pax des Dames, or the Ladies' Peace. It was a perfect name. Louise arrived in Cambrai in July 1529. Margaret arrived shortly after. They did not bring large retinues of male advisors to argue and posture. They met in private, often in Margaret's house. They talked directly and honestly. Louise fought for her son and for France. She was determined not to give up Burgundy. Margaret fought for her nephew and for the empire. She was determined to secure a lasting peace and a stable border. They found common ground. Margaret convinced her nephew Charles to drop his demand for Burgundy. This was a huge concession. In return, Louise agreed that France would renounce its claims to Italy. She also agreed to pay a massive ransom of 2 million gold écus for her son's release. And the treaty was to be sealed by a marriage. The newly freed Francis would marry Charles V's sister, Eleanor of Austria. The treaty was a masterpiece of compromise. Both sides gave up something important. Both sides got something they desperately needed. Louise got her son back and saved the territorial integrity of France. Margaret got a secure border for her lands in the Netherlands and ended a costly war for her nephew. They succeeded where all the men had failed. They did it by setting aside the public posturing and personal pride that so often got in the way of male-led diplomacy. They focused on practical solutions. They used their shared experience as rulers and as women in a world of men to find a way forward. The Ladies' Peace, signed in August 1529, brought a temporary but much-needed end to one of the most destructive phases of the Italian Wars. It was a direct result of two women deciding to mediate a conflict that their male relatives seemed determined to continue forever. Number 17, how do you stop your husband and son from destroying the kingdom? Maria Theresa ruled the Habsburg lands. She was an Archduchess of Austria, a Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and a Holy Roman Empress. She was tough, pragmatic, and had 16 children. Her husband Francis I was Holy Roman Emperor, but it was Maria Theresa who held the real power in their Austrian domains. This sometimes caused tension, but the real problem started when their eldest son, Joseph II, grew up. In 1765, Francis I died. Joseph became Holy Roman Emperor and, at his mother's insistence, co-ruler of the Habsburg lands. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Maria Theresa was a cautious, conservative ruler. She was deeply religious. She believed in slow, careful reform. Joseph II was the opposite. He was a radical and Enlightenment thinker who wanted to reform everything, immediately. He was impatient, arrogant, and believed he knew best. The mother and son clashed on almost every issue. Maria Theresa wanted to preserve the power of the nobility. Joseph wanted to strip them of their privileges. Maria Theresa was a devout Catholic. Joseph wanted religious toleration for Protestants and Jews. Maria Theresa believed in the old established traditions. Joseph wanted to modernize the state, the army, and the economy overnight. Their co-rule became a constant battle. Joseph would issue radical decrees. Maria Theresa would try to block or soften them. They would argue in person and in long, angry letters. Maria Theresa was caught in the middle. She loved her son. She knew his intentions were good. He wanted to improve the lives of his people. But she feared his radicalism would tear the empire apart. She wrote to him constantly pleading for moderation. "Do not take such violent steps," she would write. "You will upset everything." Joseph, in turn, felt stifled by his mother. He saw her as a relic of the past, holding back progress. He felt he was the emperor, yet he had to ask his mother's permission for everything. He threatened to abdicate multiple times. One of their biggest fights was over serfdom. Joseph was horrified by the conditions of the peasants. He wanted to abolish serfdom completely. The nobility was outraged. Maria Theresa agreed that the system was unjust, but she feared that abolishing it too quickly would cause a massive social upheaval. She had to mediate between, her son's idealistic vision and the practical reality of powerful, angry nobles. She managed to push through some moderate reforms, improving conditions for the serfs, while holding off her son's more radical plans. It was a compromise that pleased no one, but it kept the peace. The same dynamic played out in foreign policy. Joseph was aggressive. He wanted to expand the empire's borders. In the late 1770s, he got into a conflict with Prussia over the Bavarian succession. He was ready to go to war. Maria Theresa was horrified. She had been through too many wars. She knew the cost. She began her own secret negotiations with Frederick the Great of Prussia behind her son's back. She sent him letters appealing to him as a fellow old ruler who understood the horrors of war. Joseph was furious when he found out. He felt his mother had undermined him and made him look weak. They had a massive argument. But Maria Theresa's intervention worked. The war was averted. The conflict was settled through the Treaty of Teschen in 1779. She had prevented her son's rashness from dragging Austria into another devastating conflict. For 15 years, from 1765 to her death in 1780, Maria Theresa's life was a constant act of mediation between her son's radical future and her empire's conservative present. She was the brake on his speeding carriage. She once wrote, "I see that he and I will never agree on these matters as long as I live." She was right. Her role was to balance the two forces, to absorb the conflict between her son and the powerful institutions of the state he wanted to dismantle. It was an exhausting, thankless job, but her efforts probably saved the Habsburg Empire from collapsing into chaos. Number 16, can a queen rule when her own husband is her biggest rival? Jadwiga of Poland was crowned king in 1384. Not queen, but king. She was just a child, but she was the ruling monarch. The Polish nobles had a problem. They needed her to marry to secure the kingdom and produce an heir. But they were deeply divided over who she should marry. One faction wanted her to honor her childhood betrothal to William of Habsburg, a German prince. Another, more powerful faction wanted her to marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Lithuania was the last pagan state in Europe. A marriage between Jadwiga and Jogaila would create a massive, powerful Polish-Lithuanian union. It would also mean the conversion of Lithuania to Christianity. It was a huge political prize. But Jadwiga, a young girl, was in love with William. She felt bound by her promise to him. The nobles, led by powerful lords from Lesser Poland, effectively held her captive. They refused to let William into the capital, Krakow. They pressured the young queen relentlessly. They told her it was her duty to her country to marry Jogaila. Her personal happiness was irrelevant. The future of Poland was at stake. Jadwiga was caught between her own heart and the demands of her powerful male relatives and counselors. The Archbishop of Krakow, Bodzanta, and the powerful magnate Spytek of Melston were key figures pushing for the Lithuanian marriage. They were technically her subjects, but in reality they were her handlers. She had to mediate between their cold political calculations and her own personal feelings. There is a famous story that Jadwiga, in despair, went to the castle gates with an axe, determined to break them down and run away with William. Whether it's true or not, it captures the intense pressure she was under. She was a child being forced to make a decision that would shape the future of Eastern Europe. In the end, she gave in. She understood her duty. She agreed to marry Jogaila, but she did not simply become a passive wife. When Jogaila, who took the name Ladislaw II Jagiello upon his baptism and marriage, became king alongside her, she became a crucial mediator. Jagiello was a foreigner. Many Polish nobles distrusted him. He was also now ruling a vast combined state with very different interests. The Poles were concerned with their western border and the threat from the Teutonic Knights. The Lithuanians were concerned with their eastern border and the threat from the growing power of Moscow. Jadwiga had to bridge this gap. She was a Pole, beloved by her people. She had a legitimacy that her husband at first lacked. She acted as a mediator between her husband and the Polish nobility. When they grumbled about his Lithuanian advisors or his focus on Eastern affairs, she would smooth things over. She would remind them of the benefits of the union. She used her popularity and her piety to build support for their joint rule. She also had to mediate between her new kingdom and its old enemies. The Teutonic Knights were a major threat. They were a German military order that controlled a state on Poland's northern border. They constantly raided Polish and Lithuanian territory. Jagiello, a fierce warrior, often favored a military solution. Jadwiga, however, was a skilled diplomat. She preferred negotiation. She personally led delegations to meet with the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights. She argued Poland's case using her knowledge of law and theology. She tried to find peaceful solutions to border disputes. She knew her country, still consolidating its union with Lithuania, could not afford a full-scale war. Her diplomatic efforts were often successful in delaying or preventing conflict. She bought her husband and their new state valuable time. Jadwiga's role was to be the soft power to her husband's hard power. He was the warrior king, she was the diplomat, the unifier, the revered monarch who held the different factions together. She had to mediate between Poles and Lithuanians, between her husband and his new subjects, and between her kingdom and its aggressive neighbors. Her early life was defined by being forced to mediate between her own desires and the political needs of her male advisors. Her adult life was defined by mediating the complex conflicts of the powerful new state she had been forced to create. Number 15, what happens when the king is a child and the nobles are wolves. The Blanche of Castile became Queen of France when she married the future Louis Vide. When he died in 1226, her son Louis the Next was only 12 years old. And Blanche became regent. A foreign woman ruling France was not popular with the powerful French barons. They saw a child king and a female regent as an opportunity to reclaim the power they had lost to the monarchy. Immediately, a coalition of powerful nobles formed against her. Men like Philip Hurepel, the late king's illegitimate half-brother, and Peter of Dreux, the Duke of Brittany, led the charge. They saw Blanche as a weak foreigner they could easily push aside. They spread rumors that she was greedy, that she was trying to steal the throne for herself. They began to raise armies. Blanche was in an incredibly difficult position. She had no army of her own, only the forces loyal to the crown. She had to protect her son and his inheritance from his own powerful relatives and vassals. Her entire regency was one long act of mediation, negotiation, and, when necessary, confrontation. Her first challenge was to get her son crowned. The nobles planned to intercept them on the way to the coronation at Reims. When Blanche got word of the plot, instead of taking the main roads, she and her small group of loyal followers traveled through the countryside at night to avoid the ambush. They made it to Reims, and Louis IX was crowned. It was a crucial first victory. It gave her the legitimacy she needed. But the rebellions continued. The barons, especially Peter of Dreux, were relentless. They saw Louis as their king, but they refused to be ruled by his mother. And Blanche had to play a careful game. She couldn't appear weak, or they would overrun her, but but she also couldn't be too aggressive or she would unite all the nobles against her. She became a master of divide and conquer. She would negotiate with the rebellious barons one by one. She would offer one a piece of land, another a favorable marriage for his daughter, another a sum of money. She knew their personalities, their ambitions, and their weaknesses. She exploited their rivalries. She would peel them away from the main rebellion, isolating her most dangerous enemies. One of her key rivals was Theobald IV of Champagne. He was a powerful and ambitious noble who had at first joined the rebellion. But Blanche knew he was also a famous poet, and he was rumored to be infatuated with her. She used this. She flattered him. She wrote him letters. She convinced him to abandon the other rebels and join her side. It was a brilliant move that broke the back of the first major revolt, but the mediation was not just about politics. It was about raising a king. Blanche had to teach her young son how to rule. She had to mediate between his youthful impulses and the complex realities of power. She involved him in all her decisions. She would have him sit in on council meetings so he could learn from her negotiations. She was showing him how to be a king, not just by telling him, but by demonstrating it every day. Her regency was a constant crisis. There were military campaigns, but she often won her biggest victories at the negotiating table. She had to face down the King of England, Henry III, who tried to take advantage of the chaos in France to reclaim lost territories. She outmaneuvered him diplomatically, securing a truce that protected French lands. Blanche of Castile successfully mediated the transfer of power from one generation to the next during a time of extreme vulnerability. She stood between her son and the powerful men who wanted to carve up his kingdom. She used diplomacy, shrewd political maneuvering, and her own force of personality to protect the French monarchy. When Louis IX came of age, he inherited a kingdom that was strong and united. It was a legacy his mother had built for him, one negotiation at a time. Number 14, how did a queen's friendship with a general's wife cause a national crisis? Queen Anne of Great Britain was on the throne during a period of intense political division and a major European war, the War of the Spanish Succession. She was not a brilliant intellectual, but she was conscientious and took her duties seriously. Her rule was dominated by her relationships with two people, Sarah Churchill, her childhood friend and mistress of the robes, and Sidney Godolphin, her Lord High Treasurer. Sarah's husband, the Duke of Marlborough, was the brilliant general leading the Allied armies against France. For years, this group worked together. Anne relied on their advice. Godolphin ran the government. Marlborough won the battles. Sarah controlled access to the Queen and was her closest confidante. They were all part of the Whig Party, which strongly supported the war. The problem was that Anne herself was more of a Tory at heart. She was a devout Anglican and believed in the power of the monarchy. The Whigs were often low church and believed in a stronger parliament. This political difference was a crack in the foundation of her government. And then a new person entered the Queen's life, Abigail Masham. Abigail was a poor cousin of Sarah Churchill's. Sarah had gotten her a position as a woman of the bedchamber for the Queen. It was a humble job, but Abigail was gentle, quiet, and deferential. She listened to the Queen. She didn't argue with her or lecture her, which Sarah often did. Anne, who was often in poor health and tired of Sarah's domineering personality, grew to love Abigail's company. This shift in friendship had massive political consequences. Abigail was related to a leading Tory politician, Robert Harley. Harley was brilliant, ambitious, and wanted to end the war. He saw Abigail as his way to get to the Queen. He started giving her political advice to pass on to Anne. He told the Queen that Godolphin and Marlborough were dragging out the war for their own profit and glory. He told her they were disrespecting her authority. Suddenly, Queen Anne had two competing sets of advisors whispering in her ear. On one side were Godolphin and the Marlboroughs, the powerful Whig establishment, pushing for total victory in the war. On the other side were Harley and Abigail, the rising Tories, pushing for peace. Anne was caught in the middle. She had to mediate a massive political battle that was playing out in her own private chambers. The fight became intensely personal. Sarah Churchill, realizing she was losing her influence, became furious. She confronted the Queen. She wrote her long, angry letters, accusing her of abandoning her old friends and being manipulated by a low-level servant. This only pushed Anne further away. The political struggle came to a head in 1708. Harley tried to get his allies into the cabinet. Godolphin and Marlborough saw this as a direct challenge. They went to the Queen and gave her an ultimatum: fire Harley, or they would both resign. A resignation from the country's chief minister and its top general in the middle of a major war would have been a catastrophe. Anne was trapped. She felt loyal to Harley and his vision for peace, but she couldn't afford to lose the men who were running the war. For days, the government was paralyzed. Anne had to choose. She tried to find a compromise. She tried to get them to work together. But the egos were too big. The political divide was too deep. In the end, she had to give in. She fired Robert Harley. It was a victory for the Whigs, but a temporary one. Anne's relationship with Godolphin and the Marlboroughs was shattered. She felt they had bullied her. Over the next 2 years, she worked quietly with Harley behind the scenes. She used her royal authority to slowly bring more Tories into the government. Finally, in 1710, she made her move. She dismissed Godolphin. Then, after another bitter confrontation, she dismissed Sarah Churchill from all her court positions. The Duke of Marlborough was eventually dismissed as commander of the army. Robert Harley was brought back and made the chief minister. The government's policy changed completely. Britain began negotiations to end the war, resulting in the Treaty of Utrecht. And Queen Anne spent her entire reign mediating a bitter fight between the two major political factions in her country. This fight was embodied by the powerful, ambitious men who led the Marlborough, Godolphin, and Harley. But for Anne, it was also a deeply personal struggle, a battle between an old, demanding friendship and a new, comforting one. Her quiet, stubborn shift in allegiance away from the Whigs and toward the Tories fundamentally changed the course of British history. Number 13. Why would a queen side with her husband against their own son? Caroline of Ansbach was the Queen of Great Britain, married to King George II. She was one of the most intelligent and politically astute queen consorts in British history. She had a strong partnership with her husband and worked closely with the powerful Prime Minister Robert Walpole to run the country. But her family life was a mess. The source of the trouble was her eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. The Hanoverian dynasty had a strange and bitter tradition. The reigning monarch always hated their heir. George I had hated his son, the future George II. And George II, in turn, absolutely despised his own son, Frederick. The feeling was mutual. Frederick had been left behind in Germany for many years when his parents moved to England. When he finally arrived as a young man, he was a stranger to them. He was also everything his parents were not. They were frugal, orderly, and dull. He was extravagant, artistic, and charming. He loved to gamble and spend money. He also deliberately set himself up as a political opponent to his father. In the 18th century, the heir to the throne often became the center of the political opposition. Ambitious politicians who had fallen out of favor with the king would gather around the prince, forming a reversionary interest, a government in waiting. Frederick created a rival court at his home, Leicester House. It was a glittering center of art, music, and political dissent. This infuriated the king and queen. George II saw his son's actions as a personal and political betrayal, and Queen Caroline was even more hostile. She saw Frederick as a foolish, irresponsible liar who was undermining everything she and the king were trying to build. She famously said, "My dear firstborn is the greatest ass, and the greatest liar, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and I heartily wish you were out of it." Caroline's job was to manage this toxic relationship, but instead of being a neutral mediator, she firmly took her husband's side. She saw it as her duty to protect the king and his government from their own son. She worked with Robert Walpole to counter Frederick's political moves. When Frederick demanded a larger allowance from Parliament, trying to make his father look stingy, Caroline and Walpole worked behind the scenes to defeat the motion. The family feud was not just political, it was deeply, publicly personal. In 1737, Frederick's wife, Augusta, went into labor. In a shocking act of defiance, Frederick refused to let his child be born in Hampton Court Palace, where the king and queen were staying. Instead, he forced his wife, while in the middle of labor, into a carriage and raced her across London to St. James's Palace, just so his parents could not be present at the birth. Caroline was incandescent with rage. She and the king saw this as an unforgivable insult. They retaliated by effectively banishing Frederick and his family from the royal court. The king published a notice in the London Gazette forbidding anyone who visited Frederick's court from being received at his own. The split was now total and public. Even on her deathbed later that year, Caroline refused to see her son. The king was weeping by her side. He said he would marry again. Caroline famously told him, "No, you will have mistresses." But when her prime minister suggested she should allow Frederick to see her one last time, she refused. Her role as mediator had been a strange one. She did not try to bring her husband and son together. Instead, she mediated the political damage caused by their feud. She acted as a shield for her husband, absorbing the political attacks from her son's faction and working to ensure the stability of the government. She chose political partnership with her husband over any maternal connection to her son. It was a brutal choice, but one she believed was necessary for the survival of the dynasty. Number 12, how does a grandmother keep her grandson, the emperor, in line? Queen Victoria ruled Great Britain for over 63 years. She was also the matriarch of a family that spread across the royal houses of Europe. She was known as the grandmother of Europe. Her grandchildren included the King of Great Britain, the Queen of Spain, the Queen of Romania, and, most problematically, the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her Victoria's relationship with Germany was complicated. Her beloved late husband, Prince Albert, was German. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, was married to the German crown prince. Victoria had a deep affection for Germany. But she was also the Queen of Great Britain, a country whose global power was increasingly being challenged by the newly unified and ambitious German Empire. This geopolitical tension was mirrored in her own family. Her eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, was a charming diplomat who enjoyed the high life. He was wary of Germany's growing military power. Her grandson, Wilhelm, became Kaiser in 1888. He was intelligent and ambitious, but also impulsive, insecure, and had a massive inferiority complex, especially regarding Britain. He both admired and resented his British relatives. The relationship between uncle and nephew Bertie and Wilhelm was dreadful. Bertie saw Wilhelm as an arrogant, dangerous upstart. Wilhelm saw Bertie as a frivolous playboy who didn't take him seriously. They clashed constantly. Victoria found herself in the middle of it all. She was the only person on earth to whom both men had to defer. She was both Bertie's mother and Wilhelm's grandmother. She used her immense personal authority to mediate their conflicts and, by extension, the growing tensions between Britain and Germany. Wilhelm would often make bombastic, aggressive speeches about Germany's destiny and its need for a powerful navy. The British government would be alarmed. Victoria would then write a letter to Dearest Willie. Her letters were a masterful blend of grandmotherly affection and monarchical steel. She would address him as a beloved grandchild, asking about his family, but she would also firmly and sometimes sharply correct his political mistakes. She would write things like, "As your grandmother, I must say I think it is a great pity that you should have made such a speech." She reminded him that his actions had consequences for the peace of Europe. One major crisis occurred in 1896. It was the Kruger telegram incident. An armed raid, unofficially backed by some British figures, had been launched into the independent Boer Republic of the Transvaal in South Africa. It failed. Kaiser Wilhelm, seeking to assert Germany's influence, sent a congratulatory telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal. The telegram implied German support for the Boers against the British. Public opinion in Britain was enraged. It was seen as a massive insult and a direct challenge. War seemed possible. Bertie was furious with his nephew. The British government was lodging formal protests. Victoria stepped in. She wrote a long personal letter to Wilhelm. She did not yell or threaten. Instead, she expressed her deep disappointment. She told him how hurt she was that her own grandson would act in such a way. She explained, as a fellow sovereign, how his actions had undermined her government and created a dangerous situation. It was a letter from a grandmother, but it carried the weight of an empire. Wilhelm was chastened. He couldn't dismiss his grandmother the way he could dismiss a British diplomat. He wrote back a defensive, apologetic letter trying to explain his actions. The immediate crisis cooled down. Victoria's personal intervention had diffused a situation that could have spiraled out of control. She did this time and time again. When Wilhelm announced a massive naval building program clearly aimed at challenging Britain's Royal Navy, Victoria would write to him, questioning the wisdom of such a move. She would arrange family gatherings at Osborne House or Windsor Castle, forcing Bertie and Wilhelm to be in the same room and behave civilly. These family events were, in reality, high-stakes diplomatic summits. As long as she was alive, her personal authority acted as a restraint on her grandson's worst impulses. She could not solve the underlying rivalry between the two nations, but she could manage it through the unique personal channel of family. After she died in 1901, that restraint was gone. The relationship between her son, now King Edward VII, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, only got worse, contributing to the deteriorating political climate in Europe. Number 11. How do you hold a country together when religion is tearing it apart? Catherine de' Medici was the Queen of France, wife of Henry II, and the mother of three kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. She lived through one of the most violent and chaotic periods in French history, the French Wars of Religion. The conflict was between the Catholics, led by the powerful and ultra-Catholic Guise family, and the Protestants, known as Huguenots, led by figures like the Prince of Condé and Admiral Coligny. After her husband died in 1559, Catherine's young sons came to the throne one after another. They were often weak or too young to rule effectively, as Catherine became the real power behind the throne. For over 30 years, her primary goal was to preserve the French monarchy and the unity of France. To do that, she had to somehow find a middle path between two religious factions who were determined to destroy each other. Catherine was a Catholic, but she was a pragmatist, not a fanatic. She believed that religious persecution was foolish and counterproductive. It only created martyrs and fueled rebellion. She was a politician. She believed in compromise, negotiation, and balance. Her entire life's work was an attempt to mediate an unmediatable conflict. Her first major attempt at mediation was the Colloquy of Poissy in 1561. She brought together leading Catholic bishops and Protestant theologians, hoping they could find some common theological ground. She hoped they could debate their way to a compromise. It was a noble idea, but it failed completely. The two sides were too far apart. They ended up insulting each other. Undeterred, Catherine tried a political solution. In 1562, she issued the Edict of Saint Germain. This was a revolutionary decree. It granted the Huguenots the right to worship in public for the first time, although with restrictions. It was a policy of limited religious toleration. Catherine hoped this would satisfy the Huguenots enough to keep them loyal to the crown without angering the Catholics too much. She was wrong. The ultra-Catholic faction led by the Duke of Guise was horrified. They saw it as a betrayal of the true faith. A few weeks after the edict, the Duke's men massacred a congregation of Huguenots worshipping in a barn in the town of Vassy. The Vassy massacre was the spark that ignited the first of many civil wars. For the next 3 decades, France was trapped in a cycle of war and fragile peace. Catherine was at the center of it all. After a war would end, she would travel the country, personally negotiating the terms of a new peace treaty, a new edict of toleration. She would meet with Huguenot leaders, trying to win their trust. She would try to restrain the fanaticism of the Guise family and their Catholic League. She tried to use marriage to bridge the divide. Her most famous and most disastrous attempt was the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the leading Huguenot prince, Henry of Navarre. The idea was to unite the two factions through this wedding in 1572. The wedding brought the entire Huguenot leadership to Catholic Paris. Catherine hoped this would be her masterpiece of reconciliation. Instead, it became the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. A few days after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny. Fearing a Huguenot uprising in revenge, Catherine and her son, King Charles IX, made a fatal decision. They authorized a preemptive strike against the Huguenot leaders. The situation quickly spun out of control. Catholic mobs began killing Huguenots all over Paris, and the violence spread across France. Thousands were killed. The massacre destroyed Catherine's reputation as a moderate. The Huguenots would never trust her again. Yet, even after this horror, she did not give up. She continued to work for peace. She continued to try and find a middle way. In her later years, she had to mediate between her last surviving son, the eccentric King Henry III, and the powerful Catholic League, led by a new Duke of Guise who was trying to usurp the king's power. She also had to deal with the fact that her new son-in-law, the Huguenot Henry of Navarre, was now the heir to the throne, a fact the Catholic League would never accept. Catherine de' Medici's career as a mediator was, in many ways, a failure. She could not stop the French wars of religion. Her great peace initiatives often ended in more bloodshed, but she did succeed in her primary goal. She kept the French monarchy alive. She held the country together, however, tenuously through decades of chaos. She never stopped negotiating, never stopped talking, never stopped believing that a political solution was possible. She was a tireless mediator in a time of unforgiving fanatics. Number 10. How did an empress stop her husband from fleeing his own capital? Theodora was the empress of the Byzantine Empire, married to the Emperor Justinian. She had a scandalous past. She had been an actress and a courtesan, occupations considered utterly disreputable in the rigid society of 6th century Constantinople. But Justinian had fallen in love with her, changed the law so he could marry her, and made her his co-ruler. It was one of the greatest partnerships in royal history. Theodora was not just a beautiful consort, she was Justinian's most trusted advisor. In January 532, her value was put to the ultimate test. A riot broke out in the city. It started, as things often did, at the Hippodrome, the massive chariot racing stadium. The two main chariot teams, the Blues and the Greens, were more than just sporting clubs. They were vast social networks with political and religious affiliations. For a long time, Justinian had favored the Blues, but after some of their members were arrested for murder, both the Blues and the Greens turned against him. The riots started small but quickly grew. The crowds began chanting Nika, which means conquer or win. The Nika riots had begun. The city descended into chaos. The rioters burned down major buildings, including the original Hagia Sophia Church. They proclaimed a new emperor, a nephew of a former ruler. Justinian's government lost control of the capital. Justinian and his top advisors huddled in the palace complex, terrified. The city was in the hands of the mob. His leading generals, Belisarius and Mundus, told him the situation was hopeless. They had some loyal troops, but they didn't think it was enough to retake the city. Their advice was unanimous flee. They had a boat waiting at the palace harbor. They could escape across the sea and regroup in the provinces. Justinian was ready to go. His male advisors, the experienced politicians and tough generals, had all lost their nerve. They saw only defeat. It was at this moment that Theodora, the former actress, spoke up. She gave a speech that changed history. She told the assembled men that this was not the time to run. She said that she would not flee. She argued that it was better to die as a ruler than to live as an exile. She famously declared that royalty was a fine burial shroud, and that the imperial purple makes a good winding sheet. She shamed them. She reminded them of their duty and their honor. She told her husband that he was an emperor and he should act like one. Her words electrified the room. She had mediated the moment of crisis, not by finding a compromise, but by forcing a decision. She stopped the panic. She turned the men's fear into resolve. Inspired by his wife's courage, Justinian changed his mind. He decided to stay and fight. He ordered his generals Belisarius and Mundus to take their troops and crush the rebellion. They devised a plan. Mundus would lead his troops out one gate of the palace, and Belisarius would lead his out another. They would trap the rioters in the Hippodrome. The plan worked. The imperial troops stormed the Hippodrome and slaughtered the rebels. The number of dead was estimated to be in the tens of thousands. It was a brutal end to the uprising. The rival emperor was captured and executed. Justinian's throne was secure. The Nika riots were the single greatest threat to Justinian's long and successful reign. He came within moments of abandoning his throne and his capital. He was saved by his wife. Theodora was not a general or a politician in the traditional sense. But at the crucial moment, she was the one with the courage and the clarity of thought. She mediated the conflict between her husband's fear and his duty. Her intervention ensured the survival of his regime and allowed him to go on to his great achievements, like the reconquest of the Western Roman Empire and the building of the new Hagia Sophia. She proved that the most important advisor a ruler can have is not always a general or a minister, but someone who will tell them the hard truth when they need to hear it most. Number 9. What if the king is too weak to stop a civil war? Margaret of Anjou was the French bride of the English King Henry VI. She was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely determined. She had to be. Her husband Henry was the opposite. He was gentle, pious, and, most importantly, mentally unstable. He suffered from periodic bouts of complete catatonia where he was unable to speak, move, or recognize anyone. As England in the mid-15th century was a dangerous place, the king's weakness had created a power vacuum. Powerful nobles with royal blood in their veins were starting to eye the throne. The most ambitious of these was Richard, Duke of York. York had a strong claim to the throne himself. He also believed he could govern England better than the corrupt and incompetent advisors who surrounded the weak king. This was the beginning of the conflict that would become the Wars of the Roses. It was a dynastic struggle between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster represented by King Henry and the House of York represented by Duke Richard. Margaret of Anjou found herself at the center of the storm. With her husband often incapacitated, she had to become the leader of the Lancastrian faction. Her primary goal was to protect the throne for her husband and, more importantly, for her young son, Prince Edward. She saw Richard of York as a direct threat to her son's inheritance. For years, she tried to mediate and manage the situation politically. She was not trying to bring the two sides together in friendship. She was trying to outmaneuver York and his allies, the powerful Neville family, which included the Earl of Warwick, later known as the Kingmaker. She controlled access to her husband. She made sure that key government positions went to her allies, men like the Duke of Somerset. She tried to isolate York and cut him off from power. The situation was a political chess game. York would use his influence in Parliament to try and get himself named protector of the realm during the king's periods of illness. Margaret would work to block him, trying to form a regency council that she could control. There were constant confrontations, moments of high tension where civil war seemed about to break out. In 1455, the talking stopped. The forces of York and the forces of the king, led by Somerset, met at the First Battle of St. Albans. The Yorkists won, Somerset was killed, and the king was captured. Richard of York was now in control. And Margaret did not give up. She retreated to the Midlands and began to gather her own army. She became a warrior queen. Her role as a mediator had failed. Now her role was to lead a war, but even as she fought, she continued to use politics. She tried to win over nobles who were neutral. She used the birth of her son as a powerful propaganda tool, a symbol of the legitimate Lancastrian line. The war ebbed and flowed. Sometimes the Lancastrians were winning, sometimes the Yorkists were. In 1460, after another Lancastrian defeat, Richard of York forced a settlement called the Act of Accord. It stated that Henry VI would remain king for life, but that Richard of York, not Margaret's son, would be his heir. For Margaret, this was an unacceptable betrayal of her son's rights. She refused to accept it. She raised another army in the north. At the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, her forces won a massive victory. Richard of York himself was killed in the battle. Margaret's victory was short-lived. York's son, Edward, took up his father's cause. He was a brilliant military commander. In 1461, he defeated the Lancastrians, entered London, and was crowned King Edward I. Margaret and her son were forced to flee to Scotland, then to France. Margaret of Anjou spent her life trying to mediate an impossible situation. She was the strong leader her family needed, but the situation was beyond her control. She had to deal with a mentally ill husband, a powerful and ambitious rival, and a country deeply divided. She tried to use political maneuvering to keep her enemies at bay. When that failed, she led armies. She never gave up the fight for her son's inheritance. Her story is a tragic one, the story of a queen who was forced by circumstance to become a general, all because the man who was supposed to rule was incapable of doing so. Number 8. Can a queen save her family from their own vices? Mary of Teck was the wife of King George V of Great Britain. She was the perfect queen for her time, dignified, disciplined, and utterly devoted to the concept of duty. She was the steel spine of the British monarchy during a time of immense change, including the First World War and the rise of socialism. Her husband, George V, was similarly dedicated to duty. He was a simple, straightforward man, a former naval officer who liked collecting stamps. The problem was their eldest son, David, the Prince of Wales, who would later become King Edward VIII. And David was the opposite of his parents. He was charming, modern, and popular with the public, but in private, he was restless, irresponsible, and hated the strictures of royal life. He resented his father's rigid, old-fashioned ways. King George V was a harsh and unforgiving father. He was constantly disappointed in his eldest son. He disapproved of David's lifestyle, his affairs with married women, his casual attitude toward his duties. Their relationship was one of constant conflict. The king would shout at his son for being late, for his choice of clothes, for his political opinions. David, in turn, would withdraw and grow more resentful. Queen Mary was the mediator in this cold family war. She was caught between a husband she respected and a son she loved but despaired of. She was the only person who could speak to both of them. Her role was not to host big peace conferences, but to manage the day-to-day emotional temperature of the family. She would try to explain her son to her husband. She would ask George to be more patient, to try and understand the pressures their son was under as a modern prince in a changing world. She would try to soften the king's anger after one of David's latest transgressions. She would pass along messages, trying to rephrase them in a more diplomatic way than either man would have used. She also tried to counsel her son. She wrote him countless letters, pleading with him to be more responsible. She urged him to settle down, to marry a suitable woman, and to take his duties as heir to the throne more seriously. She understood his desire for a private life, but she constantly reminded him of his public role. "You must always remember that you are the Prince of Wales," she would write. The central conflict, of course, revolved around David's relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who was twice divorced. To the king and queen, and to the British establishment, she was a completely unacceptable choice for a future queen consort. The king was absolutely furious and refused to even meet her. Mary was just as horrified, but her approach was different. She continued to write to her son, trying to make him see the constitutional crisis he was creating. She appealed to his sense of duty, to his love of country, to the memory of his father. She was trying to mediate between his personal desires and the massive impersonal institution of the crown. In 1936, King George V died. David became King Edward VIII. Queen Mary, now the Queen Mother, had hoped that the responsibility of being king would finally make her son grow up. Instead, he was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, even if it meant giving up the throne. The abdication crisis was the culmination of this long family struggle. Mary had to watch as her son prepared to abandon the duty she had dedicated her entire life to. She met with him. She tried one last time to change his mind, but he was resolute. In December 1936, he abdicated. Queen Mary was heartbroken, but her sense of duty was unshaken. She immediately threw her full support behind her second son, Bertie, who became the reluctant King George VI. As she helped him prepare for his new role, she became a symbol of stability and continuity for the British people during a moment of profound shock. Her role as a mediator had ultimately failed to save her eldest son from his own choices, but her constant, quiet efforts had helped to contain the damage of the family feud for many years. And when the final crisis came, her own unwavering sense of duty provided the foundation upon which the monarchy could rebuild. She had spent a lifetime trying to mediate a conflict between personality and position, and in the end she showed that for the monarchy to survive, position had to win. Number 7. How can you trust your husband when he keeps his brother in a cage? Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, then Queen of France, and then Queen of England. She was intelligent, cultured, and politically savvy. Her second husband was Henry II of England. Together, they ruled a vast collection of lands known as the Angevin Empire, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. They had a famously stormy relationship and 8 children, including 4 sons, who survived to adulthood: Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John. The problem was that Henry II, a brilliant but deeply controlling and paranoid ruler, refused to delegate any real power to his sons. He had his eldest son, Henry, crowned as a junior king, a common practice at the time, but he gave the young king no lands to rule, no money, and no real authority. The young king was a king only in name. He was popular, charming, and a famous tournament knight, but he felt disrespected and humiliated by his father. He was surrounded by a group of young, ambitious knights who encouraged his resentment. Richard was his mother's favorite. He was made Duke of Aquitaine, but again, his father constantly interfered in his rule. Geoffrey was made Duke of Brittany, and John was given the title Lord of Ireland, but he was so young he was nicknamed Lackland. The sons grew deeply resentful of their father. They felt he was hoarding all the power and not giving them their rightful share of the family inheritance. Eleanor, their mother, sympathized with them. She too had grown tired of Henry's domineering ways and his constant infidelity. In 1173, the simmering family tensions exploded into open rebellion. The Great Revolt, as it was known, was a civil war that pitted the sons against the father. Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all rose up against Henry II. They were supported by the King of France, the King of Scotland, and a number of powerful English and continental barons who were eager to weaken Henry's power. Eleanor's role in this is debated by historians, but it seems clear she supported her sons. She may have even encouraged them. She saw the rebellion as a way to secure their inheritance and perhaps gain more power for herself. She tried to flee to the court of the French king, but was captured by her husband's forces. For Eleanor, mediation had failed. She had tried for years to manage the relationship between her husband and her sons, to secure a future for them. But Henry's refusal to share power made it impossible. The conflict was not something that could be talked through. It had to be fought. The Great Revolt lasted for over a year. Henry II, a brilliant military commander, eventually defeated the coalition arrayed against him. He was surprisingly lenient with his sons. He forgave them and even increased their allowances. But he was not lenient with his wife. He blamed Eleanor for inciting the rebellion. He had her imprisoned. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent the next 16 years as a prisoner. She was moved from castle to castle in England, kept under house arrest. Her role as a mediator within the family was over, for now. The fights between her husband and her sons continued. They would rebel again, form alliances against him, and continue to fight over land and power. And Geoffrey died in a tournament. The young king died of dysentery while on campaign against his father. It was only when Henry II died in 1189 that Eleanor was freed. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. Now, as the powerful Queen Mother, Eleanor once again took on the role of mediator and ruler. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade, she effectively ran England. She had to mediate the conflicts between the various powerful men Richard had left in charge, and she had to deal with the ambitions of her youngest and most treacherous son, John. John tried to seize the throne while his brother was away. Eleanor had to raise an army against her own son to protect the kingdom for her other son. She put down John's rebellion and kept the kingdom stable until Richard returned. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life shows the limits of mediation. She was a powerful and intelligent woman who tried to manage a family of ambitious, powerful men, but their personalities and the political realities of the time made peaceful compromise impossible. She had to be a politician, a rebel, a prisoner, and a ruler, all in her attempt to navigate the brutal conflicts between her husband and her sons. Number 6, who protects a kingdom when the rulers are foreigners? Alexandra of Denmark was the wife of Bertie, the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII of Great Britain. She was a Danish princess, and she never forgot it. In 1864, not long after her marriage, Prussia and Austria invaded Denmark and seized the provinces of Schleswig-Holstein. It was a national trauma for Denmark, and Alexandra took it very personally. She developed a deep and lasting hatred for Prussia. This created a very awkward situation within the British royal family. Queen Victoria, Alexandra's mother-in-law, was pro-German. Her late husband, Albert, was German. Her eldest daughter was the Crown Princess of Prussia. Victoria saw a strong, unified Germany as a positive force in Europe. Alexandra saw it as a brutal bully that had dismembered her homeland. The conflict between the Queen and the Princess of Wales over foreign policy was constant. Alexandra's husband Bertie sided with his wife. He too was distrustful of Prussian ambition. This created a rift between Queen Victoria and her heir. Victoria often complained that Bertie and Alexandra were trying to push a personal, anti-German foreign policy on her government. And Alexandra had to mediate this complex family and political situation. She had to manage her relationship with her powerful mother-in-law, a woman she respected but deeply disagreed with on this crucial issue. She had to be careful not to overstep her role as Princess of Wales, but she also used her position to advocate for Denmark and to warn against the growing power of Prussia, which would soon become the German Empire. Her drawing room at Marlborough House became a center for anti-German sentiment in London. She would talk to politicians and foreign diplomats, sharing her views. It was a form of informal personal diplomacy. She was trying to influence British policy from the inside. The situation was a constant tightrope walk. Victoria would invite the Prussian royals to Windsor. Alexandra would have to be polite to the very people she saw as her country's enemies. She had to mediate between her personal feelings and her public duty. She also had to mediate between her husband's more impulsive nature and his mother's rigid authority. Bertie often wanted to make his displeasure with the Prussians more public. Alexandra would have to calm him down, reminding him that a direct confrontation with his mother was unwinnable. This family conflict had real-world implications. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, which led to the creation of the German Empire, British sympathies were divided. The Queen was privately pro-German. The Prince and Princess of Wales were passionately pro-French. The government tried to remain neutral. The royal family's internal division mirrored the country's own uncertainty about the massive shift in the European balance of power. Alexandra's mediation was not about finding a happy compromise. There was no compromise to be had. Her view of Prussia and Victoria's view were irreconcilable. Her role was to manage the conflict, to keep it from exploding into a full-blown public feud between the monarch and her heir. She did this for decades, until Victoria's death in 1901. When her husband became King Edward VII, Alexandra, now Queen, continued her work. Edward VII was known as the Uncle of Europe, and he played a key role in building the diplomatic alliances known as the Triple Entente between Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were explicitly designed to contain the power of Germany, now ruled by Alexandra's nephew by marriage, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Alexandra's lifelong, deeply personal distrust of Germany had, in a way, become the official foreign policy of Great Britain. The family argument she had been mediating for so long had become the central fault line of European politics. Number 5. How do you rule a country that doesn't want you? Isabella of France was the wife of King Edward II of England. Their marriage was supposed to seal a peace between England and France, but it was a disaster. Edward II was a weak and incompetent king who was widely believed to be in a romantic relationship with his favorite courtier, Piers Gaveston. He showered Gaveston with titles and wealth, ignoring his powerful nobles and his own wife. Isabella was trapped. She was a young queen in a foreign country with a husband who neglected her. She had to mediate a relationship with a man who was clearly not interested in her. But the bigger problem was the conflict between Her husband, the king, and his own powerful barons. The barons, led by Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, despised Gaveston. They saw him as an upstart who was corrupting the king and ruining the country. Isabella at first tried to play the role of peacemaker. She knew that a civil war between the king and his nobles would destroy the kingdom. She pleaded with Edward to listen to his barons. She tried to get him to send Gaveston away. She also tried to reason with Thomas of Lancaster, asking him to be patient with the king. She was trying to bridge a gap between two sides that refused to compromise. In 1312, the situation exploded. The barons seized Piers Gaveston and, after a mock trial, had him executed. Edward was devastated and furious. He would never forgive the men who had killed his favorite. The kingdom was now permanently divided. Isabella continued her attempts at mediation. She gave birth to a son, the future Edward III, which strengthened her position. She was the mother of the heir. She tried to use her influence to bring the two sides back from the brink. For a few years, a tense and uneasy peace held. But then Edward II found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser. He and his father, also named Hugh, were even more greedy and ruthless than Gaveston had been. They began to seize land and power, alienating everyone. The barons rose up in rebellion again, and this time they were defeated. Thomas of Lancaster was executed. The Despensers were now in total control. They turned on Isabella. They saw her as a threat. They took away her lands and even took her children from her. Isabella was now not just a neglected wife, she was a political prisoner in her own court. Her role as a mediator was over. Her husband and his favorites had made it impossible, so she changed tactics. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV of France. The Despensers thought they were getting rid of her. It was the biggest mistake they ever made. Once in France, Isabella refused to come back. She gathered around her all the English nobles who had been exiled by Edward and the Despensers, and she began a romantic and political partnership with one of them, a powerful lord named Roger Mortimer. Isabella had transformed from a mediator into a rebel leader. She was no longer trying to make peace between her husband and his enemies. She had become his greatest enemy. She issued a public declaration condemning the Despensers and calling for the people of England to rise up. In 1326, she and Mortimer landed in England with a small army. The country rose to support them. No one would fight for Edward II and the Despensers. The king's regime collapsed almost overnight. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son, Edward III. Isabella's story is a dramatic one. She started as a queen trying to mediate a hopeless political conflict between her husband and his nobles. She tried to be a loyal wife and a peacemaker, but when she was pushed too far, she showed that she was a formidable political operator in her own right. She realized that the conflict could not be mediated. The only way to solve the problem of Edward II's disastrous rule was to remove him from power. Number 4, why did a queen have to fight her own people? Zenobia ruled the city of Palmyra, a wealthy oasis city in the Syrian desert that was part of the Roman Empire. In the mid-3rd century, the Roman Empire was in a state of crisis. It was vast, overstretched, and facing constant threats on its borders. In the east, the main threat was the powerful Sasanian Empire in Persia. Zenobia's husband, Odeionothus, was the ruler of Palmyra. He was a loyal Roman ally. He fought and defeated the Sasanians on Rome's behalf. In recognition of his service, Rome gave him a special title, Corrector of the whole East. He was effectively the ruler of the Roman East. In 267, Odeionothus and his eldest son were assassinated. Zenobia took power as regent for her young son Vabiothus, but Zenobia was not content to be a mere placeholder. She was ambitious. She saw the weakness of the central Roman government and an opportunity for Palmyra. She began to expand her power. She conquered Egypt, a vital source of grain for Rome. She then conquered much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. She created a vast breakaway state, the Palmyrene Empire. For a time, she was the most powerful ruler in the Eastern Mediterranean. Zenobia's great challenge was to mediate between two competing identities. On the one hand, she presented herself as a loyal Roman. Her son's coins at first showed his face on one side and the face of the Roman Emperor Aurelian on the other. She was claiming to be ruling the East for Rome, just as her husband had. She was trying to convince Aurelian that she was a partner, not a rival. On the other hand, she was clearly building her own independent empire. She styled herself as a new Cleopatra. She promoted a unique Palmyrene culture that blended Greek, Syrian, and Persian influences. She was trying to create a new power base that was independent of Rome. This was a dangerous game. She had to mediate between the powerful men in her own court. Some, like the famous philosopher Cassius Longinus, urged her to declare full independence from Rome. They were Palmyrene nationalists, others were more cautious. They feared that a direct challenge to Rome would bring disaster. They urged her to maintain the fiction that she was ruling on Rome's behalf. For a few years, her balancing act worked. The Roman Emperor Aurelian was busy fighting other enemies in the West. He had no choice but to tolerate Zenobia's growing power. But in 272, Aurelian turned his attention to the East. He was a tough, no-nonsense soldier emperor, and he was determined to reunite the empire. He sent a message to Zenobia's surrender. Now, Zenobia had to make a choice. Her mediation had failed. She could no longer pretend to be both a loyal Roman and an independent queen. Encouraged by her more aggressive advisors, she chose defiance. She declared her son emperor, a direct challenge to Aurelian. She prepared for war. It was a catastrophic mistake. Aurelian's legions were unstoppable. They marched through Anatolia and Syria, defeating Zenobia's armies. They laid siege to Palmyra itself. Zenobia tried to flee to Persia to seek help, but she was captured by the Romans. The city of Palmyra surrendered. Aurelian took Zenobia back to Rome. He paraded her through the streets in golden chains during his triumph, a public display of his victory. Zenobia, the queen who had tried to build her own empire, ended her life as a Roman captive. Her story is a lesson in the dangers of overreach. She was a brilliant and ambitious ruler who tried to mediate a new place for her city between the great powers of Rome and Persia. But in the end, she could not defy the military might of the Roman Empire. Number 3, how could a sister's love survive an emperor's ambition? Isabella I of Castile was one of the most powerful and famous queens in history. With her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, she united Spain, completed the Reconquista, and funded Christopher Columbus's voyage. But before all that, she had to survive a brutal political fight with her own half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile. Henry IV was known as Henry the Impotent. It was rumored that he was unable to father children. His wife, the queen, eventually gave birth to a daughter named Juana. But a powerful rumor, encouraged by Henry's political enemies, claimed that Juana was not the king's daughter. It was said that her real father was a courtier named Beltran de la Cueva. Juana became known as Juana la Beltraneja. This succession crisis tore the kingdom of Castile apart. The powerful nobles divided into 2 factions. One supported the claim of Juana, the other supported Henry's younger half-brother Alfonso. A civil war broke out. Isabella was in a difficult position. She was Alfonso's sister. She was loyal to her brother, but she was also a very cautious and politically intelligent young woman. She did not want to be seen as a rebel against her king. She tried to stay neutral, to mediate between the 2 sides. Then, in 1468, her brother Alfonso died unexpectedly. Suddenly, the faction of nobles who had opposed King Henry came to Isabella. They told her that they would support her as the new queen. This was her moment. She could have seized the throne. But she didn't. In a brilliant political move, she refused. Instead, she went to negotiate with her brother, King Henry. She knew that a continued civil war would destroy the kingdom. She wanted to secure her claim to the throne, but she wanted to do it legally. She and Henry met and negotiated the Treaty of the Bulls of Gismondo. It was a masterpiece of mediation. And Henry IV officially recognized Isabella as his legitimate heir. In return, Isabella acknowledged him as her rightful king and promised not to marry without his consent. The civil war was over. Juana la Beltraneja was officially disinherited. Isabella had secured her future as Queen of Castile, not through war, but through negotiation. But the fight wasn't over. King Henry was not happy with the deal. He tried to go back on it. He wanted Isabella to marry the King of Portugal, a man much older than her. This would have neutralized her as a political force. Isabella had other plans. She had been in secret negotiations to marry Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. A marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon would create a powerful, united Spain. It was her vision for the future. She defied her brother. In 1469, she secretly married Ferdinand. Henry was furious. He renounced the treaty and once again declared that his daughter, Juana, was his true heir. The conflict was back on. When Henry IV died in 1474, the question was still unresolved. Isabella immediately had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile, but the supporters of Juana did not give up. The King of Portugal, who was now married to Juana, invaded Castile to claim the throne for his wife. The War of the Castilian Succession began. Isabella, alongside her husband Ferdinand, had to fight for her crown. She was not just a figurehead. She was actively involved in the war effort, raising troops and money, and even riding with her armies. After several years of fighting, Isabella's forces were victorious. In 1479, a treaty was signed, and Isabella was recognized by all as the rightful Queen of Castile. Isabella's story shows a different kind of mediation. She was not trying to make peace between two idiot male relatives. She was a political actor in her own right, trying to mediate a peaceful path to her own inheritance in the face of a succession crisis caused by her brother. She tried negotiation first. When that ultimately failed, she was not afraid to fight to secure her vision for her kingdom. Number 2, how did a Chinese concubine end up ruling an empire? An Empress Dowager Cixi was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. She began her life in the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. But she gave birth to his only surviving son. When the emperor died in 1861, her 5-year-old son became the Tongzi Emperor. Cixi, along with the emperor's official wife, Empress Dowager Xian, became co-regents. In theory, they were supposed to be guided by a council of 8 regents appointed by the late emperor. These were powerful conservative Manchu officials led by a man named Su Shun. They looked down on Cixi. They saw her as an ambitious concubine who had no business in politics. They tried to sideline her and Xian. Cixi knew she was in a dangerous position. If Su Shun and his allies consolidated their power, she and her son could be pushed aside, or worse. She had to act. She formed a secret alliance with Prince Gong, the late emperor's brother. Prince Gong was an intelligent and experienced statesman who had also been excluded from the Regency Council. And together, Cixi and Prince Gong planned a coup. Cixi had to mediate this delicate and dangerous situation. She had to convince the other co-regent, the quiet and apolitical Xian, to support her plan. She had to coordinate secretly with Prince Gong, who was in Beijing while she was with the court outside the city. It was a huge risk. The coup took place in November 1861. When the imperial court returned to Beijing, Prince Gong's soldiers arrested Su Shun and the other regents. They were charged with treason. Su Shun was executed. The others were forced to commit suicide or were dismissed from power. The coup was a success. Cixi and Xian were now the undisputed regents, with Prince Gong as their chief advisor. For the next decade, this triumvirate ruled China. It was a period of relative stability and reform known as the Tongzi Restoration. They had to mediate the massive challenges facing China, including the aftermath of the devastating Taiping Rebellion and the increasing pressure from Western powers. The dynamic between Cixi and Prince Gong was complex. They were allies who had seized power together. But they were also rivals. Cixi was the mother of the emperor. She had the ultimate legitimacy. Prince Gong was the experienced administrator who ran the day-to-day business of government. They often disagreed on policy. Cixi's role was to mediate between the different factions at court. There were the conservatives who resisted any kind of change or engagement with the West, and there were the reformers led by Prince Gong, who believed that China had to adopt some Western technology and diplomatic practices to survive. Cixi generally sided with the reformers, but she had to do it carefully, so as not to alienate the powerful conservative establishment. As her son, the emperor, grew up, she had a new conflict to mediate. The Tongji emperor was a rebellious teenager who resented his mother's control. He preferred to spend his time in the brothels of Beijing rather than studying state papers. Cixi had to try and manage his behavior while also preparing him to rule. She failed. He died young, at the age of 18, without an heir. Cixi managed the succession crisis brilliantly. She chose her 3-year-old nephew to be the new Guangxu emperor. This meant that she could continue to rule as regent. She ruled China from behind a silk screen for decades. She mediated endless conflicts between conservative and reformist officials, between Chinese tradition and Western pressure, and between the members of her own imperial clan. She was a master of political survival who used her skills as a mediator and a manipulator to hold on to power for nearly 50 years. Number 1. Did a mother's ambition cause the bloodiest feud in English history? The story of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her husband Henry II is the ultimate example of a queen mediating and failing to mediate a fight between her male relatives. We've seen how she supported her sons in the Great Revolt of 1173, but the fighting did not stop there. The last decade of Henry II's reign was a blur of family conflict, a multi-sided civil war between a father and his 3 surviving sons, Henry the Young King, Richard, and Geoffrey, with the youngest, John, waiting in the wings. The sons were not united. They fought each other as much as they fought their father. The core of the problem was Henry II's refusal to give them real power and his habit of playing them off against each other. He would promise a castle to one son, then give it to another, just to keep them off balance. In the early 1180s, a new war broke out. This time it was Richard, allied with his father, against his older brother, Henry the Young King, and his other brother, Geoffrey. They were fighting over control of Aquitaine. The Young King demanded that Richard pay him homage for the duchy. Richard, who saw Aquitaine as his own, refused. It was a war of brother against brother, instigated by their father's manipulative games. Eleanor was still a prisoner in England. She was powerless to stop her sons from fighting each other. She could only watch from afar as her family tore itself apart. The war ended tragically when Henry the Young King died of disease in 1183. On his deathbed, he begged for his father's forgiveness. With the young king dead, Richard was now the heir to the throne of England and Normandy. But Henry II still refused to officially recognize him as such. Instead, he started to favor his youngest and favorite son, John. He hinted that he might give John the entire inheritance, bypassing Richard. This was a recipe for another war. Richard, feeling betrayed, allied himself with his father's greatest enemy, the new King of France, Philip II. Philip was a master manipulator who loved to exploit the divisions in the English royal family. Together, Richard and Philip launched a new war against Henry II. By 1189, Henry was old, sick, and losing the war. He was forced to meet with Philip and Richard to agree to a humiliating peace. It was there that he demanded to see a list of the barons who had betrayed him and joined Richard's side. At the very top of the list was the name of his favorite son, John. The old king was heartbroken. The betrayal by his beloved youngest son was the final blow. He fell ill and died a few days later. His last words were reportedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." And Richard the Lionheart was now king. His first act was to free his mother, Eleanor, from her long imprisonment. For the next decade, while Richard was off on crusade or being held captive in Germany, Eleanor was the one who ruled. She was the one who had to clean up the mess left by decades of male pride and ambition. She had to raise a massive ransom to free Richard. She had to put down the rebellions of her treacherous son, John. She had to hold the vast Angevin Empire together through sheer force of will. Even in her old age, she was a tireless mediator and diplomat. When Richard died and John became king, she worked to secure John's claim to the throne against a rival claimant, her grandson Arthur of Brittany. In her late 70s, she traveled across the Pyrenees to choose a bride for the French prince, a marriage designed to secure a peace treaty. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life was defined by the conflicts of her idiot male relatives. She was a queen who had to manage a controlling husband and 4 ambitious, rebellious sons. She tried mediation, she tried rebellion, she suffered imprisonment. In the end, she outlived them all, except for John. She was the great survivor, the matriarch who held the family and the empire together, a woman whose intelligence and strength were constantly tested by the endless, destructive feuds of the men around her.